Excellent.
Whoa.
Oh, we're supposed to do that at the same time. One, two. Hello.
Hi. We're off to a great start.
We're synced.
This is the clearing. That's what
Yes.
we've been calling this. Our choicing down podcast, choicing down a design studio based in Austin, Texas. We have, I guess, a little bit more grounding in what we're doing slowly but surely. We've talked a lot about relational design, and something that came online, so to speak, this past week or so is the concept of relational products. So we recently worked with a team. We had a client gig, which I think helped solidify this a bit, because just one of the things we've been thinking about is who we're working with and what we like to work on. So working with founders in particular seems to be a niche that we really like in startups. And then the concept of relational products, like what is a relational product? How might that work? Because that's a good place to practice relational design. So this is where we came up with relational products as products that have human relationships at their core. So the product is really about spaces and practices and opportunities and everything in service of making these like human connections. Yeah, so fostering meaningful relationships, really, in a way. The good stuff,
The good
the
stuff.
the quality nourishment for us humans.
Mhm.
I just read someone somewhere, it's a friend of mine actually, I'm remembering, on Twitter, saying she really doesn't like it when people refer to nourishing in anything outside of food context. So like
Yeah.
nourishing relationships or nourishing conversations, it gives her the chills.
Yeah. I mean, there's an eating image that shows up, and then, people are being gobbled, and that can be rough.
We like to create relational projects where people can be gobbled, is what.
Gobbling is one of the primary functions of the relational field.
Yes, yes. So I think a good segue, what we want to talk about today is choreography. So choreographing experiences, relational experiences. We're working on not using relational everywhere. We think maybe people will start to get the point if we use it every 3 words.
Yeah.
We don't really need to do that. So working on it, work in progress. The distinction between relational and social products is a bit of a more technical definition that we're using in our own work, because it helps us to separate out what we're doing as distinct, particularly from social media. So because there is a distinction there for us, and we did talk about this in an earlier episode, and I think this is going to be a refrain with a lot of our materials, is thinking about relational as these humans, like one-on-one group size interactions, like actual meaningful, I don't know, what's another word for interaction?
Relation. Uh,
Yeah, meaningful relations.
I think interaction or interaction is fine for now. Like interpersonal play.
Yeah, interpersonal play I think is good. And there's a distinct difference between that interpersonal play, relational play, and the bigger social networks where it's way less personal. It's more, I mean, this is the distinction that we're drawing, is that the social is humans at scale, in aggregate, in a way,
Yeah.
shape, or form that's more at an institutional level. I don't know if there's other things that come to mind other than institutional, but the relational is more like families, friends, groups of people, communities, and it can be some size there, but there's still that interpersonal or intimacy, I think, that is key.
Yeah, I think that there's a sense, and I don't know where the exact line is on this, but a relational context of a family or a small group or even a community has like a you kind of know the fabric of that thing in a different way than a giant student body or an enormous nation or a country or something like this. And so we're focused on the smaller, I guess it's richer interpersonal fields.
Totally. Definitely deeper. And one other aspect of the work that we do that we've sort of realized, I don't know how to quite talk about this, because one thing we have been talking about is that we've been doing this work for about 5 years, but we have not been talking about it or publishing on it in a way that expresses what the felt sense of going through the process and embodying the work. So we've got a backlog of 5 years, which is why a lot of the reflection that we've been doing and the work that we've been doing to compact the lessons learned, and it's deepening our own understanding because we're reflecting ourselves, and in the process of explaining it out to other people through the podcast. And then it's obviously got ripple effects. It's coming up in conversation more because we're finding that there's more bite-sized chunks of material to share that is more accessible than, the question of what do you do? And my first thought is, how long do you have? Because I need about 2 hours to get into it. So dropping that down into relational design is kind of nifty. So long-winded way of saying, I'm not really sure what this process is that we've been going through to compact and to distill into bite-sized morsels, because it feels like in the process of doing that, we are making discoveries along the way of things that have been hidden in plain view the whole time. So there's this felt sense of discovery, and we've got something new. It's not new really, though. It's been there the whole time.
I feel it's we're moving into a different orientation. So we have been practicing these things based on largely intuition and pulling from other sources and experiences and dropping into that material. But it's much different when we are trying to explain it or bring it into language that might be trainable, so that we can point out like how the thing is working, or how a practice it can be engaged with. So in doing this, we're explaining or teaching it to ourselves, and like key distinctions are showing up, and interesting points of view that explain well, like metaphors and this stuff. So yeah.
So one of the big insights or discoveries that we stumbled upon this past week is in relational products. One of the core components of what we're designing are experiences, and by talking about experiences, they are time bound. So like the big insight here was time bound. Oh, it's finite, it's not infinite, which also helps juxtapose again with bigger like social protocols, like these like big scale, and it doesn't even have to be social media, just larger social protocols, like moving through an airport is one I often give for social technology. There is like a social skill set that you use to move through places like that. Or I was writing about this the other day, going into like a bank or a post office or other places like government offices. They all operate under this like social protocol that we all understand, and it allows this big social fabric to work. They're not time-bound experiences, though. They're like open-ended. It's a good skill set to have to be able to walk in and out of those places, sure. But when we talk about relational products, the thing that really ties the room together are these finite experiences. There's a beginning, there's an end. Once we have those bookmarks or bookends rather, then we can ask the question of what happens in the middle. And that's where we get to today's topic, which is choreography. So choreographing the experience. So what does happen between the start and the finish of that finite experience?
Yeah, and the event-based nature, the specific container of temporal container has come up a lot over the past 5 years, and it's been interesting to design with that as a known quantity, because there's an aspect of designing other types of products where there's a period of engagement, and you're thinking about all the touch points within that engagement.
Sure.
But the relational context has a flow of events and milestones and or keyframes, or however you want to look at that. We'll develop the language on that, that shift perspective and relation within that field, such that when you come out of the field, you have changed in some kind of way.
Yep.
And there's a difference between that and, say, tooling, where you're using the tool in a particular process and it maybe changes the world in some way or alters a bit of information in some way. So yeah, we've been drawing out a bit of that understanding.
Yeah, something that came up for me when you were just talking is just the word tooling in this context, and thinking about artists and technicians, and when they use the tools, what the artist and technician, designer, engineer, I mean, whoever it might be, oftentimes the professionals and the people that have set down practices and routines around this, they're creating sessions, they are creating this like event-based structure. How do you get into the experience of creating in this way? How do you get out of it? And I mean, for any of us that do that kind of work, this kind of creative work, you know how important it is to set in those constraints, because the work is challenging, and creating space and time for yourself to do the work. So we're bringing that kind of concept into a group space. And yeah, similar to that idea of creating a practice space with the beginning and the end, one of the things that we talked about is it's what happens in the middle. It's the journey that you're experiencing there. When you go into that container, it's less of, I need to get this thing accomplished. Of course, you need to get something accomplished. There, you're kind of holding that as like a destination. I'm trying to get there, but how you get there really matters. It makes a difference between enjoying the experience and getting into flow states. There's probably, I'm curious if anything's popping up for you here. I know you've spent a lot of time in practice
Yeah.
spaces.
Yeah. I mean, it's forwarding the experience, the nature of the experience, and how you participate in the experience is the outcome.
Yep.
So that it may, and the drawing a distinction between the experience as the point of the design versus an artifact as a point of the design.
Yep.
And so the felt sense of being in a studio, say, where your tools are at hand, the environment is set up to drop you into a mindset, right?
Yep.
Rubens, Shangri-La studios, like, popping to mind. Like,
Yep.
everything is oriented and imbued with the sense of bringing forward the possibility of vulnerability in an artist, right?
Yep.
Now, if you were to take that same artist who is trying to tap into something really deep and bring them to, I don't know, a utility room in like a public school, like the likelihood of emergence of the kind of thing that you can get from Shangri-La is unlikely, right? And
Yep.
there's also the set container, like, for this period of time in this place, we are going to be drawing on this. And so leading up to that container, like getting into the container, performing within the container, and then easing out of it, are all important to the way that you're interfacing with reality. And so thinking about that and feeling into that is a lot of what we're talking about.
Yeah, one of the other things that we drew a distinction between is that felt sense of the time spent in the container is less like logistics. It's more like choreography, which is why we use that term. The choreography feels more human-centered, and it's evocative of dance in particular. And I'm guessing most people, when they think choreography, they think of dance or maybe theater potentially.
Yeah.
But just thinking about Rick Rubin and working with music artists, if you were doing a logistical thing of trying to optimize or find efficiency of pulling the song out of the ether, as it were, that it's just putting a lot of pressure and it's too literal. We're trying to do this. Can you now perform on this exact, I need the rhythm, I need the lyrics. Like the way that we emerge things, even in conversation, it's more fluid. There is more of a felt embodied sense that we're tapping into. And yeah, so our trick in our task, trick, like the trick of it, come back to that word, but our task as relational designers within this like set experience is to figure out a way to choreograph and work kind of with that material of the nature of people coming together and how we operate, so that there is a fluidity and a felt sense of moving through something in, yeah, it's not an effortless way. Like there's some friction, but it's designed friction at the right points in time and releasing on that friction when we don't need it. So again, this felt sense, this kept coming up when we were preparing for the
Yeah.
episode, and how important emotion and emotional states are.
Yeah, a bit of anticipating the events that will take place.
Yeah.
And the milestones. And you can, I've been feeling a bunch of this like in relationship to say narrative design, right? And writing and structuring a story or something like this. And a lot of what you're doing there is pacing it for different conflicts and resolutions and build-ups and ramp-ups and ramp downs and a quiet area and all of these
Totally.
kinds of things. And so in a participatory environment like a relational design, the people who are moving through the experience are bringing this into being. And so there are particular relational containers, experience containers, that I think can keep that pretty open-ended and have like a really dynamical situation where anything can happen, and those are probably unlikely to repeat. And I'm thinking of like Burning Man
Yeah,
examples there,
that
right?
came
Like
to
you
mind
get
for
it
me too.
once, and you know
Yeah.
moving a little bit into more structure, thinking about the flow of experience from an emotional or a growth perspective or a learning perspective, or a what kinds of frictions are they going to, are the players going to experience in this place. And game design comes to mind too.
Yep.
Like this is a key moment, and what are we hoping that they'll come away with, so that for the rest of the experience they're carrying that and they can move into to some other state of mind or some other learning environment. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think you just said player, so user comes to mind. And I think another kind of, we're sort of setting the stage, but also getting into a bit of what choreography is and how we're seeing it in experience design. So the distinction between user and player, I think, also relates to a distinction between human computer interface and UI UX, and human computer relationship, and what we're calling like a relational experience design. So I don't know if you've got something there teed up, or
Yeah,
I can kind
we've
of
been
weave around if not. Yeah.
yeah, I think it might be good to bring that up in another episode, but the broad sketch of it is thinking about UI UX and human computer interaction in terms that are thinking about the ergonomics of dealing with a computational system, right?
Sure,
So the
sure.
human, like modifying the virtual environment,
Yeah.
right? And there is an interplay there, but it tends to be very focused on sensory and behavioral things, like and getting feedback from the system, right? With the enhancements in technology that are coming online, in particular the intelligence kinds of things, there is a new layer to that interaction that moves closer to the human being
Yeah.
and less in machine terms.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this layer being, there's a direct individual computer interaction, and then there's the interaction between people, the social field, the relational field that we've been talking about, and considering how that can be forwarded as very important, and then the computational architectural environment can influence the relationship. So yeah,
Yeah, I
lots
think,
to talk about in there, but yeah.
yeah, just that the social field or relational field, if we're being technical in our terminology, because we're talking about the interpersonal, can be modulated by or affected through technology. So that's what we're interested in. It's less about how we're interfacing directly with the machine, but how we're working through technology as a tool for this interpersonal relational experience. And that's the material that we're working in.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we're at a place now where we can kind of dive into a little bit more focus and detail in how we're seeing the choreography of a relational experience. I guess how it unfolds and like the process that we use to unfold it. We tapped into it a little bit, like talking about the player and getting into the felt sense of what the experience might be like. So I think the key here, we'll talk a bit about this. We use terminology that is pretty similar to performance arts, whether it's dancing or theater of some other kind, any kind of performance, I guess music too. The term that we use, there's a couple of terms I think that are key. Play act is potentially something that's somewhat novel. We're curious where that shows up in other industries and other environments. And then rehearsal, which is like super common. So the general like broad sketch of the pattern and the kind of flow that we like to go through is to first sketch. So we're sketching out what the experience might look like from point A to point B. So that's like the container. And we don't know exactly how we're going to get from point A to point B in the beginning, but we do have some ideas. So again, broad strokes. We're just kind of throwing down what we think we want to accomplish during that time. That part of the experience, there's a whole way of doing this. We'll get into that potentially in a future episode. I think it's not that interesting, I guess. It's sort of like any other creative project. You're starting and it's the starting point. And I guess what I'd like to drive home is where you are starting in your initial sketches are not necessarily where you're going to end up, and that's fine. You want to hold loosely to this, but you know that you have a container that you are trying to figure out this movement through, and that's the choreography. So you're setting the container and then dropping in. Yeah. So that's the first phase, and then we go into play acting. When we go into play acting, like this is the core, I think, of a lot of our methodology and how we create relational experiences and how we work with clients to create relational experiences. So we're asking people to enter into the container as players, like act as if we're gonna actually role play this thing, and we play act the experience. After that, we get into like a refining where we want to, okay, we reflect back on what the play act went through, like how are things looking? We might take some notes along the way. And then it's iterative. We'll go back and forth, like drop back into the container, play act some more. Once we feel like we've got something working, we'll go into like a rehearsal. We'll do it from top to bottom, see how it feels. Again, we're iterating up and down the pipeline here, and eventually you're shipping it. So we could talk more about what the play act experience is, but the basic pipeline is sketch, play act, refine, rehearse, and then ship it. You're releasing it out to the world. And like any other iterative process, just because you shipped it, it doesn't mean that you can't go back to sketching and like, we want to rethink it because now that it's in the wild, we're getting some more input and we're thinking we could shift some things around.
Yeah. Just tacking on, I mean, the general structure, like this is what we've been doing. Specifically, say you have designers, engineers, writers, marketers or something like this. these are the people who are play acting it. They're the people who are producing the experience. And so what we're trying to do is to inhabit the mindset of the people who are going to be in the broader experience.
Yep.
And through the act of being in a container in real time, taking on different characters within the overall experience, moving through it stepwise, encountering frictions, and then having people voice like, well, I'm confused here, or I don't know what's going on, or, oh, this is good, we should go in this direction.
Yeah.
And in the case of a designer who maybe has a better sense of anticipating an emotional friction or a confusion or something like this, voicing that. In the case of development or engineering, like, I think that we can automate this part, or I've got this little piece of technology that might make this part of it more interesting or engaging.
Yep.
And so getting into a feedback loop where we are emerging through play the sense of the experience, and then codifying this in some way that we can come back to it to create a sort of spec, which we'll probably talk about.
Yeah. It's super collaborative what you're describing. And it's not just for designers. I think like I'm like that you're pulling in these examples of this cross-disciplinary thing happening. And it's not to say that like everyone on your entire team needs to participate. If it's a small team, they probably should, because you want the people who are being affected by the experience to be part of crafting the experience. And it doesn't have to be like every stage of it, but yeah, you're drawing on the felt sense, like the embodied felt sense of the participants, of the people creating the experience to make the experience by role playing it. And we often set different roles within the container depending on what the final production is going to be. So you always have players or participants, people that are going through the experience. You might also have like a facilitator, and there's other different roles that you might see in here, like moderators of some kind, assistants, like people that come in like to prompt, like, so there's lots of different roles that we might call on. And sometimes we also like on the technical point, we might call on an intelligence. So we want like a developer who has some understanding of how AI can be programmed in as an agent, because then they come in as a role within the system. So yeah, I think our biggest job when bringing other people into the container, and even with ourselves on our own projects, is setting a good container to invite people into, and then getting in that mindset to play and to, you let loose a little bit in a way that you wouldn't in a meeting. So this was another, lots of distinctions lately. It's very different than a meeting. It's more like a studio session. We're going to come into this space and we're going to act as if we're going to play act it. And so you want to be looser. You don't want to, it's not some formal thing where you're trading notes about how it could work or should work, or the thinking that you've done. All of that thinking and how you think it should or could work comes into play as you're acting the thing out. And that's where you run into frictions where someone thinks, oh, it shouldn't work that way. Someone else is like, I really think it should, because you're acting it out, and you just run into the frictions and the barriers, or where it works really well and it's flowing, you just keep going because it feels good. Like we're playing, we're riffing, it's working. Let's keep moving down that path.
Yeah. It's focused screwing around to some degree, which makes it fun. And
totally.
A big part of the creative process is typically like running into accidents like that you couldn't have planned without it. So it's designing within, and the within in this case is the interpersonal field, the experience field. And so you're dropping into the field as a participant, and playing in the environment on behalf of the future players. So and creating boundary conditions and this kind of thing. And from that place, you'll have a much better understanding than if you were 30,000 feet above and saying like, the player will go here and the player goes here.
Yeah.
Even if you do that, the best way to test it is to drop in and see what it feels like.
Yeah.
And any process that takes into account like hands-on testing of the experience or first-person testing of the experience is going to produce an experience that's significantly more enjoyable, delightful, immersive, etc.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's coming up for me here is usually you try to move into the medium of the final product, whatever it's going to be, as soon as possible. So if you're making a website, you can take notes on a piece of paper, you can sketch things out in Figma. There's lots of different ways to create a website. The movement into actually moving into the page, whatever, like if you're hand coding it or if you're using a service, but getting into that medium again of the website is important as soon as possible. So when we're talking about creating interpersonal and relational experiences, we have the ability very easily to drop into that medium immediately. So that's where we start. If this is where we're going to end up, it's going to be a relational experience. Let's do it relationally. Let's simulate that. So what we're creating is a kind of functional prototype from the get-go. And it won't necessarily be the full loop. It might not, I mean, we might just start with one component piece of that experience in a session, but we are dropping into what that final product will eventually be for other people.
Yeah, and then through the act of running into the confusions and emotional turmoils and all of these kinds of things, like the players have the player designers, I think is what we're talking about right now, will have an embodied sense of what we're attempting to do and what it's supposed to feel like. And
Yep. And the choreography, like the actual like beats, that's what we're keeping an eye out for. So how we like to run these is we create the container. So Dave and I are holding space of the container and we're helping people identify roles. Again, it could be just us, like if we're designing our own thing. And then we're finding the on-ramp to get into play. So I always have this visual of double Dutch where you're trying to find I never really, I think I might have figured out how to drop in to double Dutch, but you're looking for the pattern of the way that things are working. And then you want to jump into play and like double Dutch jump rope, you're looking into like, how do I get into the center so I can start moving in that space? So there's a bit of skill in getting into the play space. And some people, I mean, I know speaking for myself, I've had trouble when we first started doing this. It's like, wait, we're allowed to play? Well, it's not that you're allowed to, we expect it. Like, that's what we're doing. And one thing that we found is that everybody knows how to play. It is not a skill that you really have to learn. You know how to do it. You have a base level learning of it, just as a human being out in the world. Most people do. Can you get better at it? Definitely. Can you get better at it in this context? 100%. But we're drawing on something that seems to be an innate human ability, which is to play. So yeah.
Just I mean, so on the play thing, it's how we learn. Like initially, it's how animals learn. Like it is playing with the environment, testing it out, trying, and then later on, using your imagination to feel into what it would be like to do something before you do it, right? This is what role playing can be. And so we're definitely pulling on that kind of thing. Act as if, like act as if this already exists, and what does it feel like? And to the image of the double Dutch, I have that image tracks, like trying to find the rhythm of the thing. For me, it's more dancey. It's more choreographical, like in the sense that there is something that is happening and people are playing roles and getting in touch with what they're giving off and attuning to the environment and to the other players in the environment
Yep.
is starting to agree to a shared reality.
Yep.
And that shared reality may have pre-existing rules and objects and sort of forces and boundaries. Or if you're very early in the relational design process, you are emerging that stuff like through being a player designer.
Yep.
So like I'm going to try this over here and like, oh, I found a boundary condition, and then
Yep.
feeding that back, in character to the rest of the party effectively. Then we can agree that there's a boundary condition, and now the thing is starting to form itself into a sort of structural functional organism.
Yeah, that.
Mm.
And the way that we find the structural functional organism, what's a more colloquial term for that?
I mean, so that's a collective intelligence or just a group, like a troop,
Yeah,
a
shared
band,
brain,
right? Yeah, shared
shared
brain.
mental model, or yeah,
Yeah.
an agreed structure. The way that we unearth that is by creating the play container, helping people get into the space and starting to play out the experience that they're creating. And in the process, in particular, I document through notes and screenshots and a lot of notes. It helps me stay grounded in the anchors, the key touch points, the interaction points, the rhythm of what people are doing. So I just, this is a skill that I have that I've been tuning for years and years and years. It's helped me learn. I've used it in a lot of different arenas, but this one in particular, it's super fun because we're playing it live, we're doing it, it's unfolding. We don't really know exactly what's going to happen next, but we're playing to find out. So getting to capture the essence of some of that documentation during a session, I'm taking notes like that. Or if I'm live playing it, we'll often record it so that we can come back and reflect on it. And what we're doing with those key touch points, like I mentioned, they're like anchors. So we're looking, and they're kind of it's like music a little bit. We're looking to find our way from beat to beat, from note to note. And sometimes, usually we don't hit it out of the park the first time. We get some of the main key like anchor points, and sometimes they're a bit spread out, like we're missing stuff in the middle. So we start looking for, once we have the map and we can like replay it, we look for the transition points. What can we add in here? What are we missing? Are there key rhythms that are like not getting hit because we need to add another note in here? What is that interaction? So that we can hit the flow, we can find the rhythm. And it's dynamic. So we're acting things out, we're taking notes on what's happening, we're feeding back, we're reflecting in real time. And again, people seem to have a natural ability to do this. We'll hear things like, oh, when you just said that, I felt like I wanted to do this. And then someone's like, I had the same felt sense. What if we do da da da? And then that comes out as a potential next step. And it keeps playing out. So capturing those moments as they're emerging is part of kind of taking snapshots of the process as it happens.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of notation that can take place there across all of the disciplines that are available within the environment. I have a tendency to feel this in an embodied way,
Sure.
like and I tend to make notes about some felt sense or something that might provide delight, or there's a tension here and then maybe we need to go this way or something like that, or like trusting the intuition on like there seems to be a block missing here, like, and it's very story centric. Like I think that storyboarding for experiences is touching on this for sure. A choreographical map that takes into account like all the touch points across. I mean, there's a version of this within service design that's like sort of journey mapping, and so all of the places that the first person user or customer is experiencing the I don't know, the product life cycle or something like this. So
Yep.
just one other thing on that, the sense that we have is that like, because the experience that we're making has a set temporal container, we can kind of, it does have like a mandala aspect to it. There is an aspect of a closed environment, and there's going to be a beginning, middle, and end. And so we can design within that kind of thing, to and there's a pacing and a structure to it, and some of those are going to be more pleasing than others. Some of those are going to produce the kind of result that our intention is for the container better than others. So we're attuning to that as a group as much as possible. So like visualizing and setting the vision for it, and tuning that as we go, or the aspiration, is an important part of all of that.
Yeah, I think the aspiration is usually, we should definitely talk about this in a future episode, because the aspiration is in some ways the long-term vision, the long-term destination that we're going for. It helps us find directionally which way to go. It doesn't help us set the near-term goals, but it does, I mean, it does in the sense of like, does the goal align with that aspiration? But they're not the same thing. So the experiences often are stepping stones to achieving that long-term aspiration. And in some ways, achieving an aspiration is kind of a misnomer. I feel like it's a practice of being in alignment with that aspiration. And getting a bit philosophical here, the short-term goals are more of the doing. What can I do? What can I practice to be in alignment with that aspiration? So yeah, we tend to like to set up containers with an aspiration in mind to get people into that shared headspace in the beginning. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think the main sort of deliverable or like output from these sessions is the map. So there's this kind of map that is a reflection of what the experience is in this choreographed manner, with the key touch points, the transitions, the different roles, who's doing what. It's its own kind of like visual language that is cross-discipline and cross-stakeholder. So most people across your team will be able to read the map and see where they fit in. Sometimes we even break it out by, this is what's happening on the back end technically, all the way from like back end, like engineering up through developer, and then into the like front end experience with UI, UX and design. And then sort of the most forward facing is the experience itself. And that's usually where we spend the most time, but the map can map out into these different areas of concern. The tip of the iceberg is that relational experience. And that is what enables this felt sense return into the experience. So the way we document things is to help people remember what it is like in there and what's happening at that point in time, so that as they're programming or as they're designing, that they can tap into that felt sense and bring it into their work.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is a memory aid for sure, and it's a coordination aid. So like and because it emerged within this field of play where we all felt it, then it's a lot easier to be like, okay, that's what we're doing here and here and here. So that's the like tangible artifact that can come from these sessions, along with next steps and who's going to do what, and that tends to like arrange itself based on what we're feeling and what's missing and what the next session needs to be, and how we're going to work in between. And then there is a sort of intangible artifact, which is an embodied felt sense of the experience. And we're all taking that away. And when you take that away to the asynchronous environment, it is much easier to be tuned in to what you're doing in a, sort of individual contributor sense, if you still have the resonance of the play at hand.
Yeah, and that helps when you go back into another play acting session, our version of a meeting. to refine what we've created in the prior session, it's easier to drop back in.
Yeah.
And the way that we kind of move things forward is when people feel like we more or less have the shape of the experience, we're hitting the right points, it feels choreographed, there's a flow. At that point, it's refined enough. So then we're gonna move it out into the world. So I don't know, like, how do you see the distinction of like rehearsal and shipping it? Because rehearsal is kind of, it feels like all of the key points are in place. So we're moving it forward a little bit. In what way does that happen?
I think it depends on the project, and we need to do a lot more of these to like really define it. Because we've been working across a bunch of different emergent forms.
Yep.
I think if there were, if you know, like a play, for instance, or something like this, like that people have been putting on a stage for a very long time, and there's a opening date, and then there's a choreography leading up to that. You know, we are working in forms that are a little bit more new media than this. But my instinct on it is, and the process that we've been like playing with is, there's an initial sketching period, there's playing that sketch into being, there's sort of mapping it, there's then a concretization, there's a realizing. And what we're doing in that initial scope is we have an aspiration of what we want the experience to feel like, or do for the player, and we are looking for a full experience loop.
Yep.
And the full experience loop is like a beginning, middle, and end that like comes out into like, and if it is, there are sometimes flywheels in those, right? Like you can play it again, and like you'll get a similar, maybe an exact experience. This is more like a story or something on rails, but what we're mostly looking for is it has a replayability that will outcome some other experience that's in the range of what we're looking for. So rehearsal is tightening that. Once we have that thing, we're like, okay,
got you.
we're like,
Yeah.
can we repeat this? Can we repeat it twice? Can we
Yep.
repeat it 3 times? And like, is it fairly consistent? And probably somewhere before we're really certain on that, send it out the door.
Yep.
And like have other people experience it. And like, so there's a, you could do this with if there's an expectation of a launch and there is already a standing audience, and that audience like knows about the kind of thing that you make, then you set a date and you work towards that. When you're launching something new, like, and you have no idea and you're just going to like sneak it out into the world, then you just move it out when you as a play group, a play test group, are having a good time or a fun time or a delightful time or a scary, whatever the intended aspirational felt sense is, that's happening. Now give it to everybody else. And now it is rehearsed itself into liveliness effectively.
Yeah. It's ready for the bird to leave the nest kind of thing.
Sure.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that's a choreography, a relational experience choreography. That's how we do it. That's how we feel it. That's how we see it. I don't know.
I think that we covered everything we need to cover on that.
Yeah. Do you have anything else?
No, put it in the bag. We're done.
All right. We've rehearsed it and we're shipping it now.
Yes.
Cool. Well, thanks for tuning in.
Bye.
See you next time. Bye.